Trump thought he had it locked down. A ceasefire in Ukraine, both sides nodding yes. No more missiles, no more bloodshed, just a deal that could have changed everything. But then, Putin pulled the rug. Not only did Russia ignore the ceasefire, it ramped up attacks. Now, Trump's cabinet is in full-blown panic mode, the plans unraveling, the pressures mounting, and no one saw this betrayal coming this fast. So what went wrong? Did Putin play Trump from the start? Is there still a way to salvage the deal, or is the war about to explode again? This episode breaks down the backstabbing, the fallout, and what Trump and NATO can actually do now. Buckle up, this one is wild. First, let's review the actual timeline of Trump's negotiations with Ukraine and Russia, focusing on the potential ceasefire agreements that he tried to broker between the two countries. Until Trump's inauguration on January 20th, there had been virtually no progress on even attempting peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. Various countries made proposals for possible ceasefire agreements, but they were rejected by one or the other side. The representatives from Ukraine and Russia met 3 times between 2022 and 2024, but reached no agreement due to the vastly different stances on the progress of the war. Specifically, how unlikely either side was going to win significant territory. This was further complicated by Ukraine managing to invade Kursk in 2024, gaining a large foothold in Russia's own territory and cementing its intent to keep fighting until a beneficial agreement for Ukraine was reached. Even before Trump's inauguration, he made several bold claims about his ability to solve the war diplomatically. Specifically, he pointed to his amenable relationship with Putin over the previous decades as a way to reach diplomacy with Russia. In fact, one of his most famous pronouncements was that he could end the war in Ukraine in a day, if only he were given the chance to do so. When Trump assumed office, he tried to do just that, either directly or through his administration, and the US took a far more aggressive and active stance in Ukraine-Russia relations. This led to a significant increase in meetings and peace proposals. However, there was a marked shift in how the US approached the peace agreements. The administration of former President Joe Biden had previously wholly supported the Ukrainian effort, specifically its intent to join NATO and keep its pre-war territory and possibly even gain Crimea back. The Trump administration took a different route, trying to end the war as soon as possible, even if that would give significant concessions to Russia, considering that it had occupied roughly 20% of Ukraine's territory over the past 3 years. This was further complicated by Ukraine's possible admission into NATO, which directly contrasted Russia's supposed national security and integrity concerns. Simply put, the two sides couldn't agree on any kind of middle ground, so the US decided to appeal to the aggressor in an attempt to pacify them, which resulted in the following agreements and announcements, many of which go against what NATO attempted to do for 3 years. On February 12th, US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth publicly stated that returning Ukraine to its pre-2014 borders was unrealistic, emphasizing the necessity of robust security guarantees for Ukraine while expressing skepticism about Ukraine's NATO membership prospects. Shortly thereafter, on February 18th, high-level US and Russian delegations convened in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, led by US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who will be discussed further in a bit, and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, respectively. The negotiations focused on frameworks for ending the Ukraine conflict, as well as contingent economic and investment opportunities tied to achieving peace. Ukraine was notably excluded from these discussions, leading Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to express deep concern about being left out of talks that directly impacted Ukraine's future. This would set a precedent for the US trying to achieve peace solely through discussions and diplomacy with Russia, China, and even NATO, while trying to impose demands on Ukraine. On February 25th, the US and Ukraine reached a preliminary agreement, outlining the joint development of Ukraine's mineral resources, including rare earth elements, oil, and gas, as part of reconstruction efforts, and repayment for substantial US aid during the conflict. However, a key meeting on February 28th in Washington, D.C. between President Trump and President Zelensky, intended to finalize the mineral resources agreement, ended abruptly without resolution. The meeting became notably contentious, with Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance publicly criticizing Zelensky, marking a rare diplomatic confrontation between the two countries. Subsequently, the US temporarily suspended military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine, significantly increasing tensions. In actuality, the agreement in question heavily favored the US. Trump believed that Ukraine needed to repay its supposed debt to the US, and the only way for the country to do so, without going deeper into an economic crisis, was to cede its natural resources. As such, the agreement estimated the value of these resources at roughly half their actual rate. However, the US refused to give Ukraine any security assurances in the form of sending its own peacekeeping forces alongside industrial equipment and crew to extract these resources. Additionally, the ceasefire agreement never actually stated its end goal. It was ambiguous enough to allow Russia to resume its attacks with impunity, while Ukraine was forbidden from receiving vital aid. Despite all that, Zelensky preliminarily agreed to the terms of the mineral deal, as it would give Ukraine a much-needed reprieve from non-stop fighting and allow it to recuperate and regroup its forces for when the fighting inevitably continues. And yet the agreement was never ratified, as Trump believed that Zelensky wasn't willing to end the war. Efforts to mend these diplomatic strains continued. On March 11th, after further discussions in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, Ukraine agreed to support a US proposed 30-day ceasefire with Russia. In return, the US resumed military aid and intelligence cooperation, signaling a potential de-escalation of hostilities. Then on March 18th, a phone call between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin resulted in Putin agreeing to a partial ceasefire, a 30-day halt in attacks specifically targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure, though Russia refrained from committing to a comprehensive ceasefire. The move was intended to create a more favorable environment for further diplomatic negotiations. However, mere hours after the ceasefire was supposed to take effect, both Russia and Ukraine restarted hostilities, with a series of attacks on vital military and industrial compounds. A day later, Russian soldiers bombed Russia's own gas pipelines, at least according to reports from Ukrainian intelligence services. Kyiv accused Russia of sabotaging the Sudza pipeline, which had been vital in supplying Europe with Russian gas through Ukraine. According to Ukraine, Russia is now trying to negate the ceasefire deal that it had signed, or at least partially agreed to, with Ukraine through US diplomacy. This move undermines Trump's authority in attempts to end the war, contrary to his previous statements about a long-standing friendship and understanding with Putin. On Russia's side, this could be explained by the relative lack of effect that the ceasefire would have on the state of the war. According to the Kremlin, a 30-day ceasefire, to which both sides agreed recently, would technically give nothing to Russia, while allowing Ukraine much more freedom to regroup. However, that viewpoint is technically faulty at best. In actuality, both sides of the conflict can heavily benefit from stopping the fighting, even for as little as a month, due to the enormous economic, humanitarian, and military losses they have accrued over the past 3 years. For both Russia and Ukraine, the ceasefire is a vital step forward in reviewing their current standing in the war and how much they stand to gain by continuing it. On one hand, Russia opposing the ceasefire makes sense, as its primary goal in the war has been to completely occupy Ukraine. On the other hand, given that Russia is making progress at a snail's pace and that every innovation it brought to the battlefield seems to have been countered by Ukraine, the 30-day ceasefire could finally give its military strategists the opportunity to do what they should have done from the start: adapt to the ever-changing battlefield conditions. Regardless of the possible benefits that Ukraine and Russia could receive from a ceasefire, it seems that Russia isn't willing to cede to the demands imposed by Trump and his administration. This refusal goes directly against the preliminary agreements to the ceasefire, even though Russia was the one who arguably gained more from it, as the US still hasn't reversed its relatively pro-Russian stance as of late. This has led to the Trump cabinet being caught between a rock and a hard place. Trump's claim to have Russia under control was based on the possibility that the US would be able to force Russia to accept an outright peace agreement, if not at least a ceasefire that could lead to one in the future. But Trump's actions so far included trying to pacify Putin with deals that heavily favored Russia, while at the same time trying to extract as much value from Ukraine as possible, namely through the aforementioned mineral deal that Zelensky actually agreed to, at least tentatively. It's at this point we have to acknowledge the two main players in the Trump administration who have led to this contradictory response: Marco Rubio and Elon Musk. Since becoming US Secretary of State in January 2025, Rubio directly engaged in negotiations with both Russian and Ukrainian representatives. Apart from approaching Lavrov in the meeting in Riyadh, Rubio's also been instrumental in trying to arrange a more positive US-Ukraine relationship, amid Trump's erratic actions considering the war and where the US fits into NATO's donation scheme. It was Rubio's efforts that led to the ceasefire agreement in early March, one that Russia tentatively agreed to, then outright broke with the escalation in hostilities. This could put a strain on Trump and Rubio, as the former seemed to have based much of his hopes on Russia accepting the ceasefire on his positive relationship with Putin. Rubio himself has also drastically changed his approach to Ukraine-Russia relations since January. Previously recognized for his hawkish views and outspoken criticism of Putin, whom he had labeled a gangster and war criminal, Rubio shifted to align more closely with Trump's diplomatic approach, emphasizing peaceful negotiations over continued military escalation in Ukraine. Ultimately, this diplomatic approach seems to be yielding relatively little, which could lead to further vitriol in Trump's administration. Rubio's failure to create a ceasefire agreement that works in both Russia's and the US's favor undermines Trump's previous announcements and attempts to end the war, as he considers it a significant US investment that would see no practical return. This could also connect to Trump's erratic policymaking, especially concerning foreign relations, trade, and diplomacy, which have all been key news in the past few months. This unpredictability goes beyond his approach to Russia and Ukraine. Trump has imposed severe trade tariffs on long-standing trade partners like Canada, Mexico, and China. With Canada in particular, Trump announced severe tariffs of up to 50% on vital metal exports. Canada responded by announcing electricity surcharges toward the US. With a near-immediate response, Trump backed out of ratifying the tariffs mere days later, and Canada did the same. Similar concepts apply to Trump's relations with China, where tariffs have been imposed, trade bans enacted, and then policies reversed all in a matter of months. With the possibility of trade and diplomatic relations practically turning on their head one day after another, pretty much every country has been confused about the approach the US is taking with its foreign policy. This drastic shift between one state of affairs and the next in the Trump administration underlines the seemingly random approach Trump has had to the conflict in Ukraine since the very start. A part of Trump's campaign was proclaiming that he could end the war in mere days, something which might have been a significant factor in his getting elected. When he did get elected, no such peace came, and all Ukraine received were threats to end the war one way or another, and deals that would put it in debt without security assurances. Then the US administration took a practically 180-degree turn from supporting Ukraine in the war, suspending all military and intelligence aid for a week to force Ukraine's hand. While the move arguably worked and got Ukraine to accept a ceasefire agreement, it showcased that the US doesn't actually possess much diplomatic gravitas with Trump in charge. His approach so far has been similar to Putin's, trying to impose his own rules and demands while ignoring the other side, in this case Ukraine. With Rubio's failure to get Russia to agree to a ceasefire in practice, Trump might decide to clean house and change important members of his administration. While this could extend to Rubio being dismissed as the Secretary of State, it could also have consequences for another large player in Trump's administration, Elon Musk. Musk has emerged as a prominent figure in the US administration under President Donald Trump, leading the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. The initiative, conceived during the 2024 presidential campaign, was officially established by executive order in January 2025, appointing Musk as a senior advisor to streamline government operations and significantly reduce federal spending. This essentially makes Musk a member of the government while also giving him a completely new role separate from it that still allows him to act independently. Musk's ambitious objective includes consolidating around 400 federal agencies into a more manageable number, suggesting that 99 is more than enough, with potential spending cuts reportedly up to $2 trillion, a figure exceeding the government's total discretionary spending in 2023. Under Musk's leadership, DOGE has initiated aggressive workforce reductions across various federal agencies. Notably, the Civil Rights Office within the Department of Homeland Security faced substantial layoffs, prompting concerns regarding the administration's ability to oversee sensitive immigration and civil rights policies effectively. Musk's involvement has drawn both praise and criticism. While reporters, especially within the Republican Party, applaud his efforts to curb government waste and introduce private sector efficiency, critics highlight concerns about possible conflicts of interest due to Musk's extensive business dealings, some closely tied to government contracts. But Musk has also been a vital factor in the war in Ukraine through his company SpaceX. Early in the war, SpaceX granted Ukraine limited use of its Starlink program to get real-time access to its advanced communication and surveillance infrastructure. The Ukrainian military leveraged Starlink for battlefield communications, drone operations, and coordination efforts, significantly boosting their defense capabilities against Russian forces. It could be argued that Starlink became a lifeline for defending Ukraine from the invading Russia. However, as the war dragged on, SpaceX began limiting Starlink's functionality in certain frontline operations. Reports indicated access was restricted in active combat zones and Russian-occupied areas like Donbass. Elon Musk and SpaceX leadership stated that Starlink was never meant to be weaponized, and clarified it wasn't intended for controlling drones or engaging in offensive strikes, despite the system being used that way earlier in the war. Many viewed the shift as SpaceX's effort to avoid becoming too deeply involved in the conflict, At the same time, Starlink's vital role in Ukrainian communications raised growing concerns, particularly within NATO, about the outsized influence a private tech company now held over wartime infrastructure. After being appointed to the US administration, Musk began using X, formerly Twitter, to shape public narratives around the war. One of his most controversial ideas, sanctioning Ukraine's wealthiest oligarchs, those he claimed were blocking peace efforts by pushing President Zelensky to reject territorial concessions. Musk argued that it wasn't Ukraine's people prolonging the war, it was its billionaires. This wasn't the first time Musk had made statements seen as undermining Ukraine's position. After initially supporting the country with Starlink access, he proposed a peace deal in late 2022 that would have had Ukraine surrender all Russian-occupied territory, a plan Kyiv immediately rejected. But something changed in 2025. Most notably, Musk's older posts had focused on the war itself. His more recent ones, they've started targeting Zelensky directly. This could be seen as an extension of his attempts to guide US diplomacy through his social channels and influence the way Trump views Zelensky. Arguably, Musk has pretty much aligned his view of the war to that of Trump's, depending on the point in time. In February, Musk repeated an unsubstantiated claim from Trump that Zelensky's approval rating stood at just 4%. However, Musk's own fact-checking tool corrected this assertion. Reacting to this correction, Musk vowed to fix the feature, alleging that the fact-checking system he typically praises was being manipulated by governments and media organizations. This goes to show just how difficult it is to discern between legitimate attempts to help Ukraine and Russia end the war and guide public opinion through disseminating news or views that could be falsified at any point. Throughout all this time, the rest of NATO, France, and the UK in particular have attempted to create a middle ground between the US's fluctuating opinions and attempts to pacify Russia, and Ukraine trying to get the help it needs to stay in the war and repel it. On March 2nd, British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer hosted the London Summit on Ukraine, bringing together leaders from 16 countries to coordinate support for Ukraine amidst the ongoing Russian invasion. The summit underscored a once-in-a-generation moment for European security, emphasizing decisive action over prolonged deliberation. Dubbing it the coalition of the willing, the movement could force Trump to yet again try to change gears into supporting Ukraine, so long as he sees that there's diplomatic and geopolitical profit to be made. At the same time, Trump's previous criticisms of NATO, which were founded on the claim that many members weren't paying their share of defense contributions, were practically solved due to necessity, as Europe drastically changed its outlook on the possibility of being at war with Russia in the near future. At the same time, the volatility of the current US administration, especially in recent weeks, means that every politician must tread carefully when trying to deal with Trump. This makes it practically impossible to predict how the proposed ceasefire or peace agreements would actually turn out for Ukraine and Russia. All we can do is go day by day and report on the newest developments. But what do you think? Will the US administration once again change its approach to Russia? Thanks for watching, and let us know what you think in the comments.